It's with much pleasure that I welcome Julia Pitman to the meeting. And Julia is going to speak to us on a topic, the Central Methodist Mission and resettlement of Jewish refugees at Kuitpo. I'll give a little bit of background about Julia. Hopefully a lot of you will have read the summary that was in the newsletter, but Julia is the Justice and Solidarity Research Officer for Uniting Care Wesley Adelaide and the Uniting Church Synod of South Australia, a position she has held since December 2001. She's currently completing a PhD in History at the University of Adelaide, and her subject is, and I love the title, Prophets and Priests, Women in Australian Congregationalism, 1927 to 1977. She is co-editing a collection of essays on religion and social policy topics for the United Nations World Council of Churches Decade to Overcome Violence, 2001 to 2010. Thank you, Julia. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your society this evening. It's with great pleasure that I note some of my colleagues from the University of Adelaide here this evening, who I'd be more than happy to introduce you to after the meeting so that you can encourage them to come and speak to you at future events. And also I'd like to formally welcome Marjorie Luno from the Jewish community, who has broken with tradition and has been prepared to come out on the beginning of the Sabbath to be involved in this meeting this evening. It was at her instigation that I embarked upon this project, which I thought would be something small that I could do in my spare time, and it became larger and larger. When she asked me if I would speak to the AGM for the Jewish Genealogical Society, and I agreed to do that, and I'm yet to do that, and I suggested that it might be, the research might be of interest to a wider group, and so here I am tonight. In 1939, Kuitpo Industrial Colony, an independent entity that was associated with the Central Methodist Mission in Adelaide, assisted the Australian Jewish Welfare Society, based in Melbourne, to resettle 16 Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. Depending on how numbers are estimated, these refugees constituted about 1/5 of the total number of Eastern European Jews that migrated to South Australia between 1931 and 1940. Kuitpo Colony provided one of a number of agricultural training schemes that the federal government used through the Jewish Welfare Society to resettle refugees for a brief period between May and September 1939. The passing of the National Security Act in September 1939, however, meant that during the Second World War, a much larger number of Jewish refugees were interned with other migrants who were deemed to be a security risk at Hay in New South Wales, Tatura in Victoria, and Loveday near Barmera in South Australia. Attention to the partnership that developed between the AJWS and Reverend Samuel Forsyth, the Superintendent of the Central Methodist Mission and the founder of Kuitpo Colony, has not been explored by historians, but has potential to enrich our understanding of the interaction between non-government organisations during a formative period of refugee policy. It also forms an episode of the history of relations between people of different faiths in South Australia. Impetus for consideration of this topic, as I've said, has come from the Jewish Genealogical Society, but hopefully the research will be of interest to you this evening. The following presentation, I hope, will seek to set in context the emergence of the partnership between Kuitpo and the AJWS and the experience of the refugees to some extent. Evidence is available from the archives of the Uniting Care Wesley Adelaide, the Adelaide Hebrew Congregation, private papers, reports from the Metropolitan and Rural Press, and also from the refugees themselves. I hope to argue that this phase of refugee resettlement was generally positive and reflected the cordial relations that existed between Jews and Christians in South Australia. Until recently, such a conclusion might have been considered controversial. For debate among Jewish historians about the level of anti-Semitic prejudice in Australia in the 1930s would almost certainly have deemed this episode a glaring exception in a litany of woe, rather than a reflection of generally good relations. As such, the research would not be seen as particularly significant historically. but directions set over 10 years ago by W.D. Rubenstein in Jewish Refugee Historiography provides a useful framework within which to consider this snapshot of South Australian history. Subsequently, other historians have developed these directions set by Rubenstein further, particularly Bernard Hyams in his General History of the Adelaide Hebrew Congregation. Rubenstein argued that no other issue has aroused more discussion in debates about Australian Jewish history than the admission to Australia and the treatment by the federal government of Jewish refugees during the Holocaust period and the first post-war decade. Received historical understanding has generally fallen into two broad camps: those who view relations between Christians and Jews as governed by prejudice on the one hand, and on the other those who believe that the principle of religious voluntarism led to respect between the two groups. In the first accounts of policy relating to Jewish refugees that historians produced in the 1980s, the views of the first camp were dominant. These works, which were meticulously researched and very influential, were largely negative in their assessment of Australian refugee policy. Their authors were overwhelmingly critical of all aspects of the policy, from the intentions of the government, to the number of admissions, to the views of opinion makers, and to the role of the Anglo-Australian Jewish community itself. A major concern of these historians was the reason why so few refugees, only between 7,000 to 9,000 Jews, settled in Australia in the 9 years between 1933 and 1941. The federal government, they argued, influenced by a combination of prejudice, concern that Central and Eastern European Jews were tainted with Bolshevism, and a desire to maintain Australian jobs during the economic depression of the 1930s, and to preserve pro-British immigration policies, severely restricted European Jewish migration to Australia. Before the Second World War, Australia thus kept out and, by omission, condemned to the gas chambers thousands upon thousands of victims of the Nazi regime. From the government down to its agencies, all players were motivated by self-interest, prejudice, and conceit. Recent scholarship, developed in the light of Rubenstein's revisionist essays, however, has been much more sympathetic to the government and its agents. It has sought to explore the historical significance of Australia's reception of Jewish refugees in the context of an emerging refugee policy. Rubenstein argues that early historical accounts, while factually correct, were not set in an appropriate context. By focusing on the inadequacy of Australian immigration policy, historians had failed to address the motivating factors of Jewish migration and to set the level of anti-Semitism in the context of Australian attitudes to racism and religious pluralism. His most significant critique was that the received understanding of Australia's response to Jewish refugee history, written by historians educated in the post-Second World War era, had suffered from being viewed from the perspective of post-Holocaust eyes. It is our knowledge of the unspeakable tragedy of the fate of the Jews that makes today's historians so critical of the pre-war immigration policies of the democracies. According to Rubenstein, the reception of Jews in the pre-war period, far from constituting an embarrassing failure in policy, marked the beginning of the liberalisation of Australia's immigration laws and formed the origins of multicultural Australia. The admission of Jewish refugees before the Second World War occurred in the absence of a humanitarian policy. It was the first time that the government had admitted any refugees as a matter of policy. Jews from Eastern European countries such as Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia were favoured over the cause of other refugees such as those from Armenia, Greece, Spain and Russia after the First World War. When the federal government authorised the Australian Jewish Welfare Society to nominate 2,250 Jewish migrants in January 1939, it was the first time the government had allowed a non-Anglo-Celtic group to participate in the formation of policy and resettlement. This shift in policy was motivated by international revulsion at Hitler's persecution of the Jews and was accomplished in a hostile economic climate over a short period of time. Few Jews considered permanent migration until the full aims of the Hitler regime became apparent on Kristallnacht, a night of Nazi destruction of Jewish property in November 1938. European Jews did not choose Australia as a first choice of destination due to its distance, the cost of the journey, including landing money, and their lack of knowledge about Australia. Australia was not as popular a destination as the United States or Palestine because of the influence of Zionism and existing migration patterns. Consequently, significant numbers of Jews had no wish to migrate to Australia, nor did they have any contacts established in Australia who might have been able to assist migration. But the hardening of US immigration policies caused Jews to look to other places. Those who eventually fled to Australia were often assisted by family or business contacts, or because they were able to obtain visas granted by Australia ahead of other countries. At this time, policymakers were not yet aware of the full horrors of the Nazi regime and could not have predicted how the object of the Hitler regime from June 1931 would be the murder of every Jew in Europe. But as refugees from Nazi Germany became an international concern during the 1930s, the Australian government improvised a refugee policy from a pre-existing framework developed for the purpose of restricting immigrants from various categories and carefully balancing religious and political groups within the population. In 1937, the Jewish community created the Australian Jewish Welfare Society to streamline the resettlement of Jewish refugees. This move was significant because German refugees were from a former enemy country and were seen as alien even to the Jewish community, which had generally identified itself with Britain. In June 1938, the federal government introduced a quota of 3,600 refugees on top of 1,500 nominated Jewish immigrants. In July, an international conference was held in Evian-les-Bains in France to discuss solutions to the refugee problem. Stanley Bruce, the High Commissioner in London, urged the Australian federal government to accept 30,000 refugees. But in December, John McEwen, the Minister for the Interior, announced that Australia would accept 15,000 refugees over the next 3 years, of whom 80% would be Jewish. The outbreak of war meant that less than half of these 15,000 actually arrived. 1,500 in 1938 and about 5,000 in 1939. The numbers of Jewish refugees attracted to South Australia were low in comparison with other states, and very few settled in Adelaide, but those that did settle here began to transform the local Jewish scene. Over time, the estimates taken by historians of the number of European arrivals have increased. Early studies noticed that from about 3,600 Jews who came to Australia between 1931 and 1940, only 63 came to South Australia. But Bernard Hyams has recently argued that a list of European arrivals from 1937 to 1940 that is kept in the records of the Hebrew congregation indicates that there were 70 different family names on the list, which could have represented up to several hundred people. Equally, the demand for seats in the synagogue increased markedly. Rubinstein argues that the Australian reception of European Jews was an application of commitment to religious freedom, as expressed in the Australian Constitution, in the context of outrage at the Nazi discrimination against the Jews. This concern, he has argued, outweighed the anti-Semitism that scholars have documented in recent years. In the context of Australian social prejudice, anti-Semitism has been a minor issue in comparison to racism against Indigenous people and Asians, and sectarianism between Catholics and Protestants. When compared internationally, Australian attitudes towards Jews were generally much better than those of other countries, such as Britain, where there is an established church, and the United States, where there are entrenched social exclusions. By the 1930s, Jews had become successfully integrated into the Australian community, and anti-Semitism belonged to the lunatic fringe. The concern of Australian Jews that European immigrants would disrupt their acceptance in the Australian community should also be viewed in the context of the general support they in fact received from the Christian majority. The Jews that came to South Australia were welcomed into a community that was small, declining and anglicised. Of all the Australian states, the South Australian Jewish population was the third largest in absolute numbers behind those of New South Wales and Victoria, and South Australia was the only state in which the Jewish population had begun to decline. The overall number of Jews in South Australia had decreased from 840 in 1891 to 528 in 1933. In New South Wales and Victoria, by contrast, the Jewish population had grown to almost 10,000 people in each of these states. Most South Australian Jews lived in Adelaide, where the first synagogue had been established in 1848, and there's a picture of it there. But by the late 1930s, they had a diminishing interest in religious observance. Politically conservative and loyal to the British Empire and its institutions, South Australian Jews were proud of the fact that they'd been admitted to positions of political power before Jews were admitted to the House of Commons in England. Joseph Montefiore, for example, was one of 11 commissioners appointed in 1834 by King William IV to establish the colony. And I've got a few slides of other prominent Jews, such as Solomon, who was Premier for a brief period in 1899, I believe. Jenny Stock will correct me if I'm wrong. And Lazar, who was the first mayor, Jewish mayor in Adelaide. While Australians on the far right and the far left of politics certainly did promote anti-Semitic views, and as a result Jews were excluded from conservative institutions such as the Adelaide Club, nevertheless middle-class Australians respected them for their class values of thrift, honesty and industry, which transcended any racial prejudice they may have had. Consequently, Jews were admitted to the institutions that allowed them upward mobility, such as private schools, non-government associations and service clubs. The response of the Jewish community to Jewish refugees was defined by the tension between two principles: Kol Israel Avarim Zeh B'Zeh, that the destiny of the Jewish people is one, and Dina de Malkuta Dina, adhere to the laws of the land, that provided that they do not violate the teachings of the Torah. Concern for Jews abroad had to be matched with allegiance to empire and nation amid fear of the appearance of disloyalty. The Adelaide Hebrew Philanthropic Society most fully realised the seriousness of Hitler's aims in 1935. Fresh terrors having for their object the complete annihilation of our brethren in Germany are continually being inflicted, they said. It supported Jews who were denied entry to the United States as a positive addition to the Australian community. From the early 1930s, some German Jews had made contact with the Adelaide Hebrew congregation to find links in order to justify migration, and by November 1936, the congregation had received a letter from the London Jewish Welfare Committee requesting support. The congregation responded by establishing a local committee to manage further requests for assistance, but it did not meet for 12 months. Reverend L. Reuben Zaks, the first minister of the congregation, who was employed there from 1936 to 1939, was its secretary. The Welfare Committee met Jews coming off the boats at Outer Harbour and assisted them in gaining employment. South Australian Christians had identified with the Jews during the education debates and had reacted strongly against the pogroms and the Dreyfus affair. By the early 1930s, the Christian churches were very concerned about the rise of Hitler. They joined a coalition of political organisations and the Adelaide Hebrew congregation to plan a public meeting and to issue a statement upon Hitler's accession to power in 1933. The Premier of South Australia was to have moved the major motion of protest, but as representatives of the federal government sought to avoid embarrassment to the British government in its relations with Germany, this meeting did not proceed. The Adelaide Hebrew congregation sent a large donation to London to help the victims of the Nazi regime, and at a public meeting of the South Australian Council of Churches, held on the 29th of May 1933, the following resolution was carried. The Council of Churches of South Australia views with horror and deep regret the awful persecution that is being meted out to the Jews in Germany. Remembering that they are the kinsmen of our Lord and Master Jesus Christ, we trust that the rulers of that great land will speedily give these unfortunate Hebrews the protection they so urgently need. Recently, Peter Monteith from Flinders University has shown how the Lutheran community in South Australia sought to assist Jewish refugees through an article in the London Times in 1938, as they had been shocked into action by the Kristallnacht. They hoped to assist Jewish refugees as they themselves had been assisted to escape persecution in Prussia in the mid-19th century. Alas, these efforts were thwarted due to bureaucratic processes and the outbreak of war. From September 1938, the Australian Jewish Welfare Society established mutual farms to promote rural settlement for those who did make the journey to Australia safely. They sought to train refugees who could find work in the city in agricultural techniques on small properties. In 1938, they purchased a farm at Chelsea Park near Windsor and other properties in New South Wales. The Victorian branch of the AJWS sent boys to Chelsea Park and also to Kuitpo Colony in South Australia. The farms included poultry farms, mixed farms and glasshouse tomato growing enterprises. Glenn Palmer, who has explored farm training as part of the experience of unaccompanied refugee and evacuee children, has argued that farming was attractive for young men who wanted to save money. Reverend Samuel Forsyth had established contact with the Jewish community previously through fundraising efforts for Kuitpo Colony. Reverend L. Rubensacks negotiated with Forsyth for the refugees to be admitted to Kuitpo. Forsyth reported to the Kuitpo board at the end of May 1939 that the Jewish Welfare Society had agreed to the board's offer to take 30 Jewish refugees at £1 per week and to take 15 immediately on arrival. Samuel Wynne, a guardian and member of the Australian Jewish Welfare Society in Melbourne, arranged for the Adelaide Welfare Society to sponsor them. He was a wine merchant and would have known about Kuitpo through his investments in vineyards in South Australia and his regular trips through the McLaren Vale region. The Jewish Welfare Society's agreement with the government was to sponsor the cost of migration. 4 Jewish boys from Poland were the first who elected to go to Kuitpo, and this is 3 of them here: Alec Katz, Simon Klipnick and Jack Schwartz. Neville Hicks has argued that Kuitpo was the most ambitious project of South Australian Methodism in the 1930s and the most significant non-government venture during the Depression years that sought to address unemployment. A rural colony established on Crown land near Wollonga, Kuitpo was the response of Forsyth to the effects of the Depression on single, unemployed men. And I've got some images of the conditions at the colony here. In contrast to the rhetoric of the state government and the Trades and Labour Council, Forsyth's program of an austere and structured lifestyle and systematic training in agriculture provided real solutions to unemployment. Hicks has shown that Forsyth was determined to establish Kuitpo in the face of sustained opposition from government and the expectation from within Methodism that the colony should be self-supporting. When the plight of the refugees became apparent to Forsyth, the Depression had eased and he saw an opportunity to continue his service to the community, which the Kuitpo board received favourably. The reception of refugees was a further application of the objective of Kuitpo as a refuge for individuals who suffered from circumstances that were not of their own choosing. By the time Forsyth was appointed superintendent of the Central Methodist Mission in 1929, he had established a career as an energetic preacher and leader. He had held pastorates in country and suburban churches and also as a transport chaplain during the First World War. He was appointed to the position of superintendent from 1929 and held it until 1952. His personal motivation and awareness of the limits of Christian worship equipped him well for his post. He believed that to see a need was to hear a call, and that the greatest sin of all was to do nothing in the presence of need. His vision of Kuitpo was not a task that was set for his job at the mission, but one related to it that he adopted. Kuitpo Colony catered for over 6,000 men over 21 years, and its success in placing men in employment forced the state government to question its own policies. Forsyth's cultivation of connections with philanthropists including Sir Langdon Bonython, Tom Barr Smith and Shirley Jeffreys, a state MP and an active Methodist layman, ensured that the scheme was funded by private and public sources. Sir Alexander Hoare Ruthven, Governor of South Australia, also provided strong support for Kuitpo. But it was a large anonymous donation from an elderly woman who appeared to have given her life savings to Kuitpo that started a stream of community giving to the scheme. The Jewish community had established a connection with Forsyth through their support of fundraising for Kuitpo, especially through the Jewish Women's Guild. Forsyth's wife, Ida, had formed an ecumenical and interfaith coalition of women's organisations, eventually called the Kuitpo Helpers Association in 1933, that raised funds for Kuitpo. The association included Anglicans, Catholics and the Jewish Women's Guild. A classic Methodist minister's wife, Ida saw her role as essentially complementary to her husband's, though she used remarkable imagination and intelligence. Certainly Samuel Forsyth would not have been able to achieve half of what he did without her active support. Through small, regular financial contributions, these women raised sums that were the equivalent of a sizable contribution from a benefactor. The auxiliaries reflected the vision and the structure of the Red Cross during the First World War, but simply applied their efforts to the question of unemployment. They drew women from the community in suburban and country areas who pledged threepence per week and conducted other fundraising activities. This committee structure sought to attend not only to the material, but also to the psychological needs of the colonists, as they believed that the men would be helped mentally by awareness of the number of women involved in assisting them. The annual gala was a major community event, and the Kuitpo Centenary Gala in 1936 included a voting competition in which women descendants of early settlers, who dressed in early 19th century costumes, represented the pioneer ships on which their forebears arrived in South Australia. The event raised £1,600, and by 1939 women were involved in motoring competitions to raise funds for Kuitpo. The Jewish Women's Guild supported the Kuitpo scheme enthusiastically. In 1933, after their first visit to the colony, the Guild raised funds that were sufficient to build a medical hut. It was this work that Reverend Samuel Forsyth noted as part of his rationale for helping the refugees. The Jewish community, he said, has always been keenly interested in Kuitpo and has assisted the colony generously. We are pleased to help them in their hour of need as they have helped us. Susan Rutland has suggested that women were more welcoming to Jewish refugees and migrants than men were, as men were fearful of its impact on their status in Australia. But the Kuitpo example shows that men, as much as women, were concerned to rally around a cause. The roles they adopted in forwarding this cause were simply determined by gender norms. To welcome refugees was a Christian ideal that church leaders encouraged all people, but particularly women, to act upon. Where men could offer philanthropy, women could offer time to the cause of refugee resettlement. The refugees who came to Kuitpo Colony were part of the first group of 20 boys brought out from Poland by the Polish Jewish Relief Fund, started in Melbourne in 1935. On 22 April 1939, they boarded the Oronze from London and landed in Melbourne on the 28th of May. By late June, 4 of these Polish refugees, Simon Klitnik, Alex Katz, Jack Schwartz and Werner Teitel, had arrived in Kuitpo. Aged between 15 and 16, they were from Herne in Germany, Brest-Litovsk on the Russian-Polish border, and Sarno also on the border. 2 of the Polish Jews had been abruptly told to leave Germany the previous October. A further 12 boys arrived over the next 3 months, and 3 of these had been in concentration camps. The training at Kuitpo was physically demanding but generally appropriate for the needs of young refugees, some of whom had been trainee farmers before they left Germany and hoped to start farms of their own in Australia. The conditions at Kuitpo were a draw card for refugees, according to Glenn Palmer, who's compared the various settlement schemes, as the colony provided basic clothing and farm training. Teitel remembered in later years that while the Polish community in Melbourne was not welcoming, and that he and a few others had left for farming in Gippsland to get away, at Kuitpo they got full board and lodging, old railway uniforms supplied by the government, and 5 shillings a week. Over a period of several months, the young men gained a basic knowledge of agriculture through their work and some knowledge of English through use of school readers, as well as general conversation before going to Australian farms for wider experience. Kuitpo was run according to a rigorous routine designed to keep men mentally alert and physically active through a structured life reflecting something of the austerity of Methodist discipline. It is unlikely that the rules and regulations issued in 1939 by the manager, W.H. Tucker, changed for the refugees. The consumption of alcohol on the colony grounds was not permitted. The colony was 10 miles walk from the nearest pub. The rising bell went at 7 a.m, breakfast was served at 7:15 a.m, and all huts had to be clean and tidy when the working bell went at 8 a.m, Monday to Friday. Lunch was served between 12 and 1, and the boys knocked off at 5. They turned their lights off at 10 during the week and 9:30 p.m. on Sundays. There were to be no firearms, no fires lit, no gambling permitted at the colony at all, and the colonists had no opportunity to leave the colony to visit the city other than by the Friday night truck. Each man was issued a set of working clothes comprising trousers, tunic, overcoat, 2 changes of underwear and socks, stout boots, towel, 3 good woolen blankets and a bush rug. Their blankets remained the property of the colony. Duties provided experience ranging from clearing, wood cutting, hauling timber, sawing for building, boring and sinking wells, to care of sheep, poultry, pigs, cows and a dairy, and the development of butchering and small goods making skills. Other duties included building, boot repairing, blacksmithing and car repairs, lorry driving, road making, cooking and kitchen work. Farmers came regularly to the colony to hire farm hands, and the refugees insisted in going in twos. "We didn't want to lose our identity and be lonely," said Alec Katz. A lot of farmers didn't like it naturally. Reverend Samuel and Ida Forsyth influenced public opinion in support of refugee resettlement as part of their broader promotion of Kuitpo through public speaking tours and media work. Forsyth embarked on a number of country trips to raise awareness of Kuitpo. The success of these trips was dependent upon the strength of Methodism in country areas. A further attraction was Sam Forsyth's Irish brogue, which brought an instant recognition when he travelled in country places, according to his son, Elliot Forsyth, due to his activity as a radio preacher, first on the ABC and then on 5KA. Miss H.E. Whitford, who had been organising secretary for the Kuitpo Helpers Association since 1937, secured media coverage and the consent of local employers and civic leaders in centres such as Broken Hill, Renmark, Clare, Peterborough, the York Peninsula, Naracoorte and Mount Gambier to hold badge days and other fundraising activities such as appeals for grain, dried fruit and meat. A significant event was an 11-day tour of the southeast region of South Australia and Melbourne that the Forsyths conducted by car in August 1939 with their assistant, Miss Heather Patterson, who operated a film projector. The Forsyths showed a film, The Romance of Kuitpo, which depicted the colony since it had been established in 1930. And I have some sections of that film here, which we'll be able to look at over our supper. And unfortunately, I've got all bits of the film except the bit where the Jewish refugees were recorded, because only 2/3 of it have been preserved. So if anyone knows where the other third is, it'd be excellent to find that and put it back into the Uniting Care Wesley Adelaide archives. The first pictures showed the first trees being felled, and the last, in brilliant technicolor, showed the Jewish refugees being welcomed to the colony and starting work at Kuitpo. While they were in Melbourne, Ida Forsyth took the opportunity to visit the Jewish refugee children's home in Bowen called Loreno. Later the name was changed to the Francis Barkman Home that was established in 1939. She had a particular interest in child welfare, and this is some of the pictures inside the home. It was donated to the Welfare Society. The Forsyths had a particular interest in child welfare as they lived next door to the Methodist children's homes in McGill, of which Ida's husband was supervisor, and she interacted with the children who came to the house on a regular basis. The media portrayal of the refugees suggested that they were intrinsically valuable and would be offered shelter from persecution, but that they were acceptable because they were able to assimilate into Australian life and were an asset to the community. The Forsyths, who were concerned to reassure those suspicious of foreigners, supported this view with accounts of the impressions of the refugees gleaned from the Australian colonists at Kuitpo. In August 1939, 20 Jewish refugees were about a quarter of the total number of men at the colony, and one news report suggested that the Australians called them, quote, a bonza lot, and that Ida Forsyth remarked that they were, quote, quite popular with the other colonists and had plenty of pluck and a great sense of humour. The Forsyths also used media opportunities to meet the stock responses of the labour movement that refugees would take Australian jobs, especially as the Bulletin magazine had claimed falsely that the refugees were crowding Australians out of the colony. The Forsyths countered this charge with the fact that the Jewish Welfare Society had guaranteed financial support for 5 years, and that meant that at Kuitpo, quote, no Australian will be deprived of opportunities there. In his public statements, Reverend Forsyth challenged Hitler's persecution of the Jews in his portrait of the refugees as assets on which Germany had failed to capitalise. Jews were, quote, fine young men, according to Forsyth, full of hope for the future and not afraid of work. In a poignant reflection on the Nazis' policies as the ultimate form of self-harm, He said, "The country that drives out men of this type is committing suicide." Equally, Ida Forsyth portrayed the children at Loreno as model citizens, and she could not understand why any country did not want the children she had seen. Some of them were very beautiful and most intelligent. Glenn Palmer has argued in her book Reluctant Refuge that child refugees, as isolated from their parents and expected to assimilate into Australian life, never experienced the love they craved and lived as an island, but that the support of the Jewish community meant that Jewish child refugees fared better than other evacuees from Britain. Published photographs and the film mentioned above emphasised the structured life and back-breaking work done at Kuitpo, including images of men bent over cross-cut saws and axes clearing timber. There were about 700 ewes and 600 lambs on the farm, together with cows, poultry and pigs, all of which required management. The film also showed tree felling, fencing operations and other structural work. News reporters portrayed the refugees as eager to adapt themselves to the new life ahead, and as working long and hard at Kuitpo Colony to learn Australian farming methods. The young men come from good families, are well educated and look the sort of settler that should benefit Australia. They are happy to be here and eager to please, clicking their heels together and bowing from the hips when shaking hands. In the Adelaide News, Ernest Simon, Henry Meyer and Isaac Schwartz were shown busy hoeing onions. Simon Klipnik, a 15-year-old Polish boy trained as a cabinet maker, was photographed on duty in the kitchen with a winning smile. Though he had never drawn a drop of milk, despite his ambition to be a farmer, he was reported to have voluntarily left his warm bed at 5 a.m. today to make a start milking cows. The audiences of the film appreciated it in their own different ways. The local paper from Bordertown reported that at one screening there was a loud applause from the audience when it witnessed the construction of a huge dam and saw the completed job. In addition to providing water for agricultural purposes, it also serves as a swimming pool for the colonists. In Melbourne, Sam and Ida Forsyth showed the film in private screenings to social workers as their latest achievement in social work, and also at Cadena, a Jewish club in Carlton, Victoria, where, as an observer reported, the hall was crowded with Jewish people, including many refugees, and I sat among the group of Jewish lads. They were thrilled when they saw some of their friends on the screen and chatted excitedly in their own language as they recognised them. The sight of their friends chopping down trees and attempting to milk cows or to work in the garden afforded them great amusement. Reports also suggested, however, that the persecution of the Jews by the Nazis continued in the minds of Jewish refugees at Kuitpo. Ida Forsyth remembered that the refugees had been very fearful of speaking of their past because most of them had parents and other relatives left behind within Hitler's reach, and they were worried that he'd hear what they said. The refugees were impressed that Australia was a free country, but they felt that they remained unable to talk about their past for security reasons. One news report said, "Today there arrived in Adelaide 8 strong, healthy young men, fearless looking, but yet afraid of Hitler. Because of that fear, they must be nameless when they speak, and when they talk, it must be of the future and not of the past. For though these Jews have escaped from Hitler, 3 of them from his concentration camps, their parents and relatives are still within his reach. They still fear that Hitler may yet hear them, so for them Australia is not yet a country for free speech." The cost of refugee resettlement, however, was the framework within which refugees were considered assets to the community and the expectation of perpetual gratitude that was engendered in their minds. The construction of media images also cultivated a response of perpetual gratitude from the refugees themselves in the light of their experience in concentration camps. One oral history study has found that both the refugees and others in the community felt that the experience of the refugees that came to Australia before the Second World War were less important than the stories of those who came out after the war. For those who came out before the war carried guilt that they had survived, while other members of their families, friends and acquaintances had not. Of the 20 boys that came out on the Aronsay, only Alec Katz's father survived the Holocaust. "Say thank you for us," was the view of one refugee. The gratitude of another, who spoke to the press, implied the legacy of his previous experience in a concentration camp. "It is fine, Grand, very fine indeed. We do definitely like it here. They do not hurry us. The work is here, and we do it, and it is a fair day's work. Michael Blakeney has argued that the resettlement of refugees in country areas was a logical development of the policies of government, which allayed concerns that the refugees would concentrate in ghettos. Ultimately, however, he argues that the rural settlements failed as the young men went into the armed forces and older settlers moved to the cities where there were established Jewish communities. But the involvement of the AJWS in farming schemes was simply interrupted by the war and was not resumed after it ended as circumstances had changed. Post-war immigrants had little interest in working on farms. During the war, the community settlement schemes declined due to change in government policy. Jewish refugees were classified as enemy aliens and were interned. At the start of the war, the Jewish lads were still at Kuitpo. Ida Forsyth recalled that nearly all the able-bodied men at Kuitpo either joined up or went into various branches of war work. The refugees, some too young for military service, stayed several months before moving on to other positions. By May 1940, the refugees had mostly found positions on farms. Werner Teitel, for example, stayed at Kuitpo for 5 months and then worked for an Italian family in the Adelaide Hills. He later returned to Melbourne with the other boys who had gone farming at the end of 1939 and went back to a dairy farm in Gippsland. But eventually he settled for the communal life of Carlton. Equally, the plans of Alec Katz were interrupted by the war. He commented that his dream was to sponsor his family to come to Australia and to live on a farm. He said that he would have stayed on a farm with somebody as company had it not been for the war. As allies, Polish boys were eligible to enlist in the armed services, but the introduction of manpower regulations interfered with the attempts of Polish boys to enlist. Having passed the Air Force exam, Alec Katz's employer complained that the recruiting office that he was on protected industry. He moved to a farm, also protected industry, and was eventually conscripted into the army. Early in 1942, Allied aliens not in protected industry and who had not volunteered for the Australian Imperial Forces were conscripted into the Australian Military Forces, or militia. Werner Teitel was involved in an employment unit made up of Europeans who were denied combat duty. Denied service in the AIF, he was transferred to the AMF and ultimately into the Labour Corps, where he was assigned to loading and unloading ammunition and supplies onto railway carriages. When a change in policy in late 1942 provided an opportunity to transfer to the AIF, Simon Klipnik volunteered. 6 weeks later, he was killed in action in New Guinea. The refugees who survived the war would eventually make Australia their home. The farm schemes had provided them with immediate accommodation and some opportunity to become integrated into Australian culture. Reverend Samuel Forsyth reported to the Kuitpo board, for example, that in contrast to the skills they had on arrival, when they left they had greatly improved their conversational powers and were much better equipped to face Australian conditions. Bernard Hyams has argued that Jewish refugees gave life to the community in Adelaide and saved it from decline. The reception of Jewish refugees by Australian citizens played an important role in the preparation of Australian society for migrants. The work of the Forsyths and their many friends influenced in part the resolve of Methodism and Australian Christianity more broadly to be involved in refugee resettlement schemes after the war. In 1941, for example, Forsyth and 20 colleagues from South Australia were present at the General Conference of the Methodist Church in Brisbane, which resolved to accept the responsibility for the work of reconciliation through both national and international refugee relief services in a coordinated effort with other agencies such as the Society of Friends and the International Red Cross. The Methodist Church began to consider immigration work as a specialist area of ministry and suggested the appointment of chaplains and the creation of funds for a department. A crucial area of the work of the future Australian Council of Churches, formed in 1948, was refugee resettlement. The foregoing account has sought to further support the directions in Jewish refugee historiography set by W.D. Rubenstein that placed the scholarship of an earlier generation on Australian anti-Semitism within an appropriate context. The most significant result of recent research is in the area of the motivation of the actors involved in this history. Australians were driven to compassion by revulsion at the objectives of the Hitler regime. They made pragmatic assessments of how much they could assist given the resources at their disposal. The overall conclusion of the limits of the changes to refugee policy that occurred in this period is, however, largely the same. It would certainly have been better if Australians could have done more than they were able to help many more Jewish refugees to escape the Holocaust. The Central Methodist Mission's involvement in the resettlement of refugees formed an expression of its value of service to the community regardless of religious affiliation. The board of Kuitpo Colony was able to exploit an opening in Australian refugee policy, and the nature of its offer suited the direction of the Jewish Welfare Society and, to some extent, the needs of the refugees. Like resettlement schemes in other states, the period at Kuitpo benefited the refugees, materially and socially, but the arguments that refugee advocates used to support their claims were generally reactionary. To the extent that the Australian community accepted the refugees because they were good, unskilled labourers, and also expected them to receive the gift of life in Australia with an attitude of perpetual gratitude, the refugee experience reinforced the torture and trauma of the Holocaust. It also contributed significantly to setting the lens through which Australians would view refugees for generations to come.
Thank you, Julia. Any questions from the floor?
I think that Catherine was asking me to what extent we can learn lessons from this example in relation to the current political situation in terms of treatment of refugees in Australia today, both in terms of arguments that are used for accepting refugees and the resettlement schemes that are adopted. So there is a debate amongst Australians today about resettling refugees in country areas to rejuvenate rural and remote Australia. And my perspective on that would be that the research that I've presented here today points to perhaps the origins of all of these ideas in the first instance, and their limits. I believe that it's the right under UN conventions of all who are persecuted to seek asylum, wherever they choose to seek asylum, and that includes Australia, not just as not simply the first country that an asylum seeker flees to, although we have now people who seek to benefit through people smuggling from the needs of refugees fleeing persecution, which does muddy the situation somewhat. It's my belief that as Australia as a nation, we should be looking to the national interest, and that national interest involves making a fair response to international obligations. So Australia should be playing its part in resettling refugees, and we should do that in terms of numbers of intake in each year, and we should be doing it in terms of providing resettlement schemes that will provide adequate assimilation, for want of a better word, into the Australian community. Now, how the government is to do that is up to it. We simply have an example here of the Forsyths who were enterprising, who found a way to provide training and English language classes and so on at Kuitpo. I don't think that the Kuitpo experiment should be seen as support for an argument that we should resettle current refugees in country areas, because I think that's simply more about the needs of Australia than about the needs of refugees. I think refugees should be provided with opportunities in Australia to reach their own potential, either in the country or in the city.
Did you hear the question? It was regarding the change in the quota of immigration of refugees.
I doubt that they upped the quota before the international conference in France in 1938, when they for the first time suggested that they'd be prepared to take the 15,000 refugees from fleeing Nazi persecution. And this was the first time they'd recognised the need to respond to international crises such as the Nazi regime. Certainly refugees were fleeing from 1933 onward and seeking asylum in Australia, but the 1938 decision was significant because it was the first time that the government had been prepared to recognise there was a crisis and to respond.
I'd like to call on Adrian Brown to say a few words in thanks to you, Julia. You probably know Adrian.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I got a little worried there when I heard some of the questions because I had this absolutely wonderful speech worked out and began to sort of disappear into the distance. But I think tonight, Julia, you've done two things which I think historians ought to do for us. One is that you've taken what appears to be a relatively insignificant part of South Australia, and I think Wendy's question was a very apt one, because I don't believe there are a lot of people who know about Kuitpo, and in the life of the mission, Kuitpo these days is very much an appendage, no matter in its importance is certainly significant. So you've taken that and you've lifted it up out of the past and given it a significance that it deserved, and one which we really need to hear. So I thank you very much for doing that historian bit. The second bit really came from the other thing that I think historians ought to do, and that is to challenge us to make us think about what we learn from history and how it then applies to our current situation. And there's no doubt that one of the things that we did learn from the work of Samuel Forsyth, but also all of the central missions around the world, and that is that justice requires a certain level of blindness to those who are in fact the focus of your support. And it's very easy for us to take up the whole of the work that the Adelaide Central Mission did, where it did so many things in just being blind to what the community might think. And I think that you really have pushed us, in my mind anyway, into thinking about there's so many things that are there back in the 30s that we're just doing again. And we've never really learnt from history, which I always thought was the purpose of history, but somehow or other it doesn't seem to work out that way. And so I thank you very much for pushing us and reminding us that if we do listen to history, we might be able to make a difference to the way the world operates in contemporary society. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for doing those things for us tonight.